before I introduce you to our speakers and our presenters, I just want to give sort of a little bit of background on the topic. So obviously the topic's on interpreting nuclear crises from Kargil to the present, looking at cases like Cuban Missile Crisis to more recent ones, and obviously the events unfolding that we might be sort of in the midst of a crisis, or potentially in the midst of a crisis on the Korean Peninsula as well. So your question might be, why is the South Asia program hosting an event like this? And for those of you who know the Stimson Center South Asia program, we spend a lot of time thinking about nuclear crises, interstate crises, particularly in South Asia. And so we get asked, why are you guys focused on this as opposed to the Indo-Pacific strategy, or rebalancing in Asia, or Afghanistan and troop presence there? And the answer is that we are paying attention to a lot of those dynamics, but there's a reason we spend a lot more time on crises than I think most shops that work on South Asia in this town do, and that is because there's a high frequency of them within South Asia. But it's also for a reason that I think Snyder and Deasing write in their book on international crisis and geopolitics, that crisis tends to galvanize, clarify, and concentrate many important elements in international politics, and to reveal the interaction between them more explicitly than other empirical contexts. And so for that reason, it's sort of a novel space to work on, both academically as well as in terms of policy space. And obviously the consequences of nuclear crises are quite grave. And so this is the reason why we spend a lot of time on this, and we're really pleased to have scholars working on this issue, presenting their work here. We actually just recently published a book on the subject, investigating crises, looking at South Asian crises over the last 30 years or so. There's some books available outside, but you can also find this, for those of you watching online, you go to the website investigatingcrises.org, and you'll find the entire book there, publicly available for free, and feel free to delve into those chapters. One of the chapters actually, by Michael Capon, spent some time trying to understand varying levels of crisis intensity, at least empirically disaggregating types of crises that South Asia has experienced. But I think the work that Mark Bell and Julie McDonald are presenting here today adds a great deal of depth to those empirical investigations. So let me go pivot to Mark and to the rest of our panel here. So if all of you have the bios in front of you, let me just introduce Mark briefly, and then he'll give a presentation. Then we'll the rest of the panel will join us up at the dais, and we'll have a conversation, some feedback from some discussants, and then we'll get into some Q&A from the audience here today. So you have the bios in front of you, but let me introduce Mark. He's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. His research examines issues relating to nuclear weapons and proliferation, international relations theory, and U.S. and British foreign policy. His forthcoming book examines how states change their foreign policies in the aftermath of nuclear acquisition, and there's a fantastic article on this in International Security from a couple years ago that you should all take a look at. And he holds a PhD in political science from MIT, and you might be hearing a little bit about that today. But without further ado, let me introduce Mark, and he'll take it away on the presentation for about maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll move on to some discussion.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure to be here to present this work that myself and Julia McDonald at the University of Denver are doing on how to think about nuclear crises. So nuclear crises are sort of back in the news, right? And there's a lot of talk about how dangerous ongoing tensions are with North Korea, right? But I think there's a real disagreement and uncertainty about how we should think about nuclear crises, right? So on the one hand, you have people arguing, right, that the ongoing tensions between North Korea and the United States are incredibly dangerous, right? There's a real risk of miscalculation, right? On the other hand, you have people arguing that actually, the risk of things going wrong is not that high, that we shouldn't be too worried about what's happening. And so there are a lot of basic questions, right, that people disagree about. What is the risk of nuclear use in a nuclear crisis? What determines who wins a nuclear crisis, right? Is the nuclear balance important? Is the conventional balance important? Is nuclear superiority a useful thing to have in a nuclear crisis? Does that get you anything? How significant is the nuclear threshold, right? How much of a barrier does the nuclear threshold present? How feasible is it to signal within nuclear crises, right? And ultimately, how scared should we be? right? And different scholars, different analysts, different people thinking about this question have very different opinions about the answers to these questions. So what we're trying to do in this paper and this work is to sort of try to think systematically about how the answers to some of these questions might vary depending on particular features of nuclear crises. So, I think when people think about nuclear crises, we often, we think about the Cuban Missile Crisis and we sort of draw lessons from that, right? And I think that's a common thing that people do, but what we argue in this paper is that there isn't a single logic of nuclear crises. And they vary on at least 2 dimensions. And we're going to talk about 2 dimensions here, but potentially there are other dimensions that you could think about. And those dimensions have really important implications for how the dynamics of nuclear crises operate and the answers to those questions that I showed before. So the first dimension I'm going to talk about is the incentives for nuclear first use. Right? And particularly, the way we're going to think about this, and you might be able to come up with other sort of ways of thinking about the incentives for nuclear first use. But first is if there's significant nuclear asymmetry. Right? If there's significant nuclear asymmetry, what we argue is that that creates incentives for first nuclear use on both sides. For the side that has significantly more nuclear weapons, right? If you have a lot more nuclear weapons, potentially you have options for meaningful damage limitation if you can go first, right? The possibility of counterforce is more plausible, more attractive, right? And you may, if your degree of superiority is sufficient enough, right, actually have the chance at a splendid first strike, right, to completely take out your opponent's capabilities. Similarly, if either side in the nuclear crisis has what Vipin Narang calls an asymmetric escalation posture, that is a nuclear posture that is specifically designed to threaten the first use of nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict, right, then we also argue that you have incentives for nuclear first use in the crisis. The second dimension that we talk about is the degree to which escalation can be controlled by the crisis participants themselves, that is, the leaders of the states involved. And here you might think about, here are sort of 4 indicators that might be related to controllability. You could probably think of others, right? But if you have robust command and control systems on both sides, right, presumably that makes the crisis more controllable, right? It's easier for leaders to be sure that their instructions are going to be followed through. Accidental nuclear use or unauthorized nuclear use is less likely, and therefore a crisis will be more controllable. If the red lines for nuclear use on each side are clear and mutually understood, again, the crisis is likely to be more controllable, right? Either side is less likely to accidentally stumble over the other side's red line for nuclear use. If in a crisis there's likely to be the interaction of nuclear and conventional forces, that makes the crisis less controllable, right? Because if you are taking conventional military actions that threaten the survivability of a state's nuclear arsenal, right, you may put that state under pressures to use them or lose them, right? You may have the commanders of nuclear forces coming under fire or under attack, and that may increase the incentives for unauthorized nuclear use or accidental nuclear use. And lastly, to the extent that there are well-established avenues for crisis communication, right, institutionalized, not reliant on back channels that may be misinterpreted and so on, right, again, that makes the crisis more controllable. And so what this leads to, if we think about these 2 dimensions, right, this leads to a typology of crises, and the dynamics that underpin those crises will be very different depending on where you fall on these 2 dimensions. So if we put these 2 dimensions up in a very simple sort of 2-dimensional space, right, you can see that you're going to have very different crises depending on where you fall. And obviously, you can be anywhere, but we're going to talk in sort of fairly simple terms about these four kind of quadrants. So the first model is say you're up here, right? There are incentives for first nuclear use, right, but crises are fairly controllable. And we call these staircase model crises because in these models, right, escalation can be very well calibrated, right? Crises are controllable by the leaders, right? But there are incentives for nuclear use, right? So nuclear first use is possible, but you can control the escalation ladder, right? The risk of nuclear use is significant, right? Nuclear use may be deliberately chosen. And nuclear weapons will loom more heavily in these crises the closer to the nuclear threshold that you get. But you're unlikely to see sudden nuclear escalation, right, without significant prior conventional escalation. And these nuclear crises will therefore be pretty varied, right? The conventional balance may determine outcomes for crises that don't escalate to a particularly high level. The nuclear balance may matter a lot more in crises that get close or beyond the nuclear level. And so nuclear superiority may be of value for these states. And the nuclear threshold can be breached, right? It's not difficult to imagine crises of these sorts going across the nuclear threshold, right? You can even imagine de-escalation from beyond the nuclear threshold within these kind of crises. Right? And if you think about the way that Herman Kahn writes about escalation, right, this is sort of the model he seems to have in mind. Right? You have all these different levels on the sort of escalation ladder. You can go up the ladder, you can come down the ladder, right? And all the time, things are more or less within the control of the statesman involved. Down here, right, you have what we call the stability-instability model, because it draws on this idea of the stability-instability paradox. The idea, right, is that there are very few incentives to strike first, and crises are controllable. Right? So these crises are pretty safe, relatively, for statesmen to get involved in. Right? There's rarely a significant risk of nuclear use, and as a result, neither the nuclear balance nor nuclear superiority should really matter that much in determining who does well and who does less well in a crisis of this sort. Right? Signaling in this kind of crisis is very possible, right, but only with conventional forces. If you make a nuclear threat, right, it's unlikely to be viewed as credible. And the nuclear threshold is very significant, right? This is a big barrier, right? It's unlikely to be breached. And again, this is sort of close to the view of nuclear crisis that's implied by this idea of the stability-instability paradox. The idea that if things are stable at the nuclear level, at the strategic level, there's space for a lot of conventional military operations to take place without too much risk of nuclear escalation. So what if you're down here? So here is what we call the Brinksmanship crises. And in this world, right, there aren't many incentives to use nuclear weapons first, but crises are dangerous, right? Crises can sort of spiral out of control. And so escalation to the nuclear level is always possible in these crises, but this is particularly dangerous, right, the closer to the nuclear threshold you get, right, the higher the level of conventional escalation. And particularly, escalation to the nuclear level is likely to be uncontrolled, right? The path to nuclear, right, neither side has the incentives to engage in deliberate nuclear use, but there's the risk of crises spiraling out of control. And therefore, we argue, these are the crises that are likely to be determined by what a lot of scholars have called the balance of resolve, right? More so than the conventional or nuclear balance. Right? Signaling is possible, and the way that you signal is by increasing the risk of this uncontrolled escalation occurring, right? What Schelling famously called, right, the threats that leave something to chance. Right? A nuclear threshold is significant, but it may be crossed, right, in a process of uncontrolled escalation. Right? And this is the view of Thomas Schelling. This is kind of the way that Thomas Schelling thinks about nuclear crises, and the way in which a lot of analysts and scholars following Schelling have also thought about nuclear crises. Right, finally, Up here are the sort of dangerous, really dangerous crises, right? These are crises in which there's the risk of non-controlled escalation, and there are also strong incentives for deliberate nuclear use, right? So these are what we call firestorm crises, right? Nuclear first use may be rational. Crises of this sort of are hard to control. Nuclear escalation may happen very quickly. It may happen with little prior conventional escalation. The conflict is likely to end with nuclear use, and therefore the nuclear balance may matter a whole lot in these kind of crises, right? Nuclear superiority is potentially very valuable. And the nuclear threshold, right, is likely to be breached and therefore is not a significant barrier. And signaling is very difficult in this kind of crisis. Okay, so I'm now going to talk a little bit about, where I think the Cuban Missile Crisis fits in, where I think the Kargil War between India and Pakistan fits in, and then talk a little bit about the implications for crises between the United States and North Korea. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we argue that there weren't significant first strike advantages, right? The US had superiority, right? But a splendid first strike was impossible. It was known to be impossible by participants. And it was clear that the US would emerge far from unscathed from a nuclear war. Both sides have their arsenals set up for massive retaliation, right? So we argue that there weren't strong first-use incentives in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there was a lack of controllability, we argue, right? More recent historical work on the way in which US command and control operated in the Cuban Missile Crisis and command and control on the Soviet side indicate that there were a lot of problems in the way in which this nuclear use could have occurred in the absence of orders from the leaders of each state. Similarly, the red lines of both states were very unclear, right? The US was very unsure how the Soviet Union might respond to different actions it could take. The US was very unsure about the political value that the Soviets attached to having these missiles in Cuba, and therefore the risks they might be prepared to run in order to keep them there. Similarly, for the Soviets, right, they weren't sure what might trigger a US invasion of Cuba or other actions. Throughout the crisis, there were several occasions in which conventional forces came into contact with nuclear-armed forces of each side. And I'm happy to talk more about that if people are interested. And lastly, there were limited avenues for crisis communication, right? Messages were being funneled back and forth, right? These messages took hours to be delivered and then to be translated, right? And this led to, in important cases within the crises, right, real difficulties in communicating between the two states, right? In fact, it's in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, that the hotline gets established precisely because this is recognized to have been a significant danger. So we argue that the Cuban Missile Crisis comes down here. It's the Brinksmanship crisis, and it's not surprising that this is sort of the crisis that Thomas Schelling sort of writes a lot about, right, and draws a lot of his sort of inspiration from. Right? And this explains certain things about the crisis, right? Why historians seem to think that the crisis depended on the balance of resolve, right? The outcome doesn't seem to have been particularly consistent with the conventional or nuclear balance, right? It shows why luck was important for a peaceful outcome, right? Because the risk was of uncontrolled escalation. And it shows why signaling that the states took were generally in the form of actions not directly connected to military outcomes, right? The blockade, for example, right? These were signals of risk tolerance rather than actions that would, remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba. Okay, so how about the Kargil War between India and Pakistan? So we argue that there were first strike advantages, right? Pakistan had adopted an asymmetric escalation posture, right, specifically designed to threaten the first use of nuclear weapons in a conflict, right? And both sides understood Pakistan's incentives, right? Both sides were aware that Pakistan potentially had incentives to use nuclear weapons first. There was reasonable controllability, though, we argue, right? There was some, it's a little debatable, right? Hard to pass, and, research is still being done on this, but I think it's, right, command and control on the Pakistani side, partly as a result of having an asymmetric escalation posture, right, does threaten does involve the pre-delegation of authority to use nuclear weapons under certain circumstances, right? But on the Indian side, right, there's much stronger civilian control of nuclear assets. It's harder to imagine nuclear use occurring in an unauthorized way. There were reasonably clear red lines. We argue the Indians understood that as long as they kept the conflict, as long as they kept their forces on their side of the line of control, that Pakistani nuclear escalation was unlikely. There was no interaction between conventional and nuclear forces, right? And there were plentiful avenues for crisis communication, including through the United States. Right, so we argue the Kargil War comes up here. And again, we argue this explains certain facts about how the Kargil crisis unfolded. Right, it explains why the conventional balance seems to best explain the outcome. Right, Pakistan is basically conventionally outmatched. It's losing. Right, its forces are suffering significant attrition at the point at which it decides to withdraw. It explains the ability of both sides to signal their limited intentions, right? The fact that Pakistan, attempts this incursion in the Kargil region rather than into some part of the Indian heartland, right? Similarly, the reason that India restricts the geographic zone of its operations, right, signals limited intentions on both sides, and this is something that you would anticipate in this sort of crisis. It shows why it was possible for both sides to believe that both that the crisis was unlikely to cross the nuclear threshold and that Pakistani first use was credible, right? These two views seem to be somewhat in tension with each other, but if you think about them within the context of this kind of crisis, I think that makes a little more sense. And it also suggests why Pakistan might have been willing to undertake an operation like the Kargil incursion in Kargil rather than somewhere else. So what does this say about a potential crisis between the US and North Korea? So we would argue that there are potentially strong first use incentives on both sides. So for the United States, right, nuclear first use might be the only way to reliably engage in counterforce against North Korean nuclear assets. In particular, it might be an attractive way to engage in counterforce if you don't want to engage in a massive conventional military buildup, right, that might itself trigger North Korean preemption. Right? If you imagine a US operation against North Korea, presumably the US would want to knock out as much of the North Korean command and control network in as short a time frame as possible. Right? You would want the first blow to be decisive given North Korea's significant abilities to retaliate. Right? And in such a world, right, nuclear weapons may start to seem attractive, and the early use of nuclear weapons in a conflict may start to seem attractive. For North Korea, right, nuclear first use is consistent with the nuclear strategies of other conventionally outmatched powers, right? If you look at Pakistan's nuclear posture today, if you think about NATO during the Cold War, right, these are countries facing a conventional military shortfall who therefore want to signal the credible threat to use nuclear weapons early in order to deter a more conventionally powerful adversary, right? And in a world in which North Korea is a weak, right, militarily weak country, facing off against the most powerful military country that has ever existed, right, what else are you going to do? Right? How else are you going to deter the United States? Right? the ability to threaten the early use of nuclear weapons is perhaps one of the only things that might make the United States think twice in a military operation against North Korea. Right, and you can think of this in ways in which it wouldn't be automatically suicidal for North Korea to do this, right? If you can come to a place where you can use nuclear weapons against invading military forces, right, while holding longer-range missiles to deter US nuclear retaliation, right, you can maybe start to conceive of a strategic rationale for using nuclear weapons early in a conflict on the North Korean side. And of course, if North Korea is worried about counterforce, right, which it probably should be, given what I said before, right, any US counterforce effort, right, exacerbates all of these incentives, right, and triggers significant use it or lose it dilemmas. Right? If they don't use their nuclear weapons early in a conflict, it's very unlikely that they would have the opportunity to use them late in a conflict. And I think any serious crisis with North Korea would be highly uncontrollable. Right? There's probably robust command and control on the US side, but I don't think we have much idea about command and control systems on the North Korean side. The red lines for nuclear use are pretty unclear on both sides. Conventional and nuclear forces would undoubtedly interact, right? In fact, part of what you would expect to happen in any military crisis with North Korea is that US conventional forces would start to go after North Korean nuclear forces. And there are limited avenues for crisis communication, right? These are not two states who have well-established, institutionalized avenues or venues within which to communicate. So we're up here. And this is obviously the most dangerous type of crisis, we argue, right? And this has some sort of important implications, right? A war with North Korea, in our view, is likely to be a nuclear war, right? So signaling during a real military crisis with North Korea is likely to be very difficult. And in particular, right, it's likely to be particularly hard for the United States to signal limited intentions. Right? If you're North Korea, any attack from the United States, right, you have to kind of interpret it as an effort at defeating you in a sort of comprehensive way. Right? And so talk about limited strikes against North Korea, the sort of bloody nose option, right, I think is not likely to be feasible. It's going to be very hard to keep a war with North Korea limited. Furthermore, a crisis may be sudden, it may be volatile, and escalation may occur very quickly. Right? It's not going to be this sort of gradual ratcheting up of tension, right, or gradual escalation. Right? You may see significant jumps in escalation that occur once a crisis really gets going. Right? And both deliberate and uncontrolled escalation over the nuclear threshold are possible. Right? So you can imagine scenarios both in which nuclear use is deliberately, consciously, strategically chosen by either leader. Right? But you can also imagine scenarios in which escalation of a much more uncontrolled sort occurs. And so, I think a sort of bottom line is that drawing inferences from, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, or even drawing inferences from the Kargil War, right, may underestimate the danger involved in a crisis or military options against North Korea. Right? These are different types of nuclear crises that we should expect to have significantly different dynamics. So just to quickly wrap up, right? There's not a single logic of nuclear crises. Right? Different crises have very different underlying dynamics. And this, I think, for scholars, right, this helps make sense of some of the contradictory findings and views that different people have proposed about nuclear crises, right? Different crises do operate according to different logics. Different things matter to different degrees in different nuclear crises. Right? And so drawing conclusions either from nuclear crises in general, right, or from specific nuclear crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, without taking this into account may generate sort of misleading conclusions, misleading implications. Right? And lastly, I think this provides a rationale for being particularly worried about potential future US-North Korean crises. Right? These are likely to be particularly dangerous sorts of nuclear crises, right, that are particularly likely to lead to nuclear escalation. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you again for coming, and I look forward to all of your questions and comments.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and have got some excellent discussants to talk a little bit about some aspects of the paper, both sort of upsides and downsides of it. So next to Mark is Rebecca Hersman, who's the director of the Project on Nuclear Issues and a senior advisor for the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic International Studies. She joined CSIS in April of 2015 from DoD, where she served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction since 2009. And then to her left is Austin Long, who's a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, who's previously an associate professor at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. He's been an analyst and advisor to the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan, CFR International Affairs Fellow, and served at the J5 on Strategic Deterrence and Nuclear Policy Division at DoD. So maybe, Rebecca, you can lead things off, and we'll go to Austin from there.
Well, first, thanks for having me, and I actually really enjoyed reading the paper and thinking about it. It definitely raised a bunch of issues in my mind, and so I think it'll be a fun conversation. I'm not an academic. I don't pretend to be. I've spent my career as a practitioner in policy or doing policy support, and so I thought that would be the most useful way for me to read the paper. So what I'd like to do is put a couple of, I think I have 5 general points out there, and then talk about a few things in particular as we look at the North Korea problem. And I think what's really interesting about this is how does it help or not help practitioners think about the problem. Personally, I really value frameworks that help decision makers think through problems and illuminate any unconscious biases they might have. You spoke to that a little bit at the end, saying, if the baggage that you bring into as one crisis is fully informed by something else that may not have sufficient parallel, then that's going to sort of burden your thinking in a way that may be unhelpful. Whereas, more applicable experience, you walk into the room with that, it's going to help you navigate a crisis. So helping a policymaker think through where they have either constructive intuition, that's moving them in a positive direction, or where they may have some kind of unconstructed bias is really helpful because you can check yourself that way. We're all shaped by experience, but I think it's a very important thing that you create an opportunity for here that your last experience may not be the most relevant. And that's something a lot of times we have to get past, especially if you're moving fast in a policymaking setting. Policy decision-making is heavily shaped by intuition and experience. Policymakers tend to be, again, I'm going to generalize, so don't get too upset, but we tend to be highly anecdotal and narrative-driven. I think that's just a very common characteristic of many people. It's partly how experience accumulates in policy. You basically go from one experience to the next and you accumulate. So a framework helps us to think about, what's below our thinking and use that as a tool to correct ourselves, to check ourselves. You alluded to the importance of helping us to sort similarities and differences between historical cases. That's especially important here because nuclear crises are so few and highly idiosyncratic, right? Now, but I think it's even more than that. So again, a policymaker tends to start with experience and through that derive theory. So my cases are my experience, and based on my case experience, I'm deriving my own internal theory about how future actors will behave. A more academic argument, such as what you have here, starts with a theory, right, and works its way to cases. So we kind of come at it from these two different perspectives. That's incredibly valuable. We just want to know where we're coming from. One thing I really liked about this paper, but I think you didn't do nearly enough with it. I think you could totally do more. It makes luck make sense. What do I mean by that? There is actually a relationship between, you talked about this in the Cuban Missile Crisis case, I think there's actually a relationship between luck and controllability. And that's actually, I think, where that nexus lies, in my opinion. The more uncontrollable escalation is, the more easily it can be affected by outside, sometimes random factors and events, anything from weather to communications to, who woke up or who had a heart attack. So I think on personality as well, right? All of these features of luck. Did you get a good person in that crisis who had the right experience, who had a natural disposition for good crisis management or not? That's a feature of luck. You can't engineer it into the case, but it's I think it's more relevant when controllability is not present. And I think you could actually explore that a bit more deeply. I think that would be useful. I also think you make a space, but don't fully explore where there's a connection to personality. So again, if you are coming from a policymaker point of view, we approach policy from our experience, we live the case first, and people, we tend to think people matter. So this will take, whether it's the Cuban Missile Crisis or anything else, what would have been different if it had been different people in the room? I think that's really important here. You touch on that a little when you get into balance of resolve, because that's quite personality dependent, I'm wondering. And it seems, and I'll get to the North Korea stuff, but it seems like it might be quite relevant in this current crisis. Certainly Kim Jong-un seems to be, especially if you have a regime that's highly concentrated in a single individual, you're especially going to be personality. So resolve and personality are going to be closely linked. So I think that would be something that makes me want to think about a little bit more. It also makes me want to think about the relationship, and it's very important in these crises, is what is the relationship between personality, resolve, and risk tolerance? Because I think those are closely related. When we look at risk tolerance, we're saying, who has, which entity in this standoff has a higher risk tolerance? So a lot of times we know, right, and I think this would be an interesting comparison. I wonder, the United States of the Cuban Missile Crisis, did we have a higher, you sort of suggest we had a higher risk tolerance in that crisis. But if you look at now the United States and North Korea, who has the higher risk tolerance? We are so status quo now. We often have actually in crisis a very low risk tolerance, increasingly, I would argue. Some of that has to do with, and that asymmetric risk tolerance can affect things, and I think it certainly affects this balance of resolve, especially if you are dealing in a crisis where leadership and control is highly concentrated, and where there might be a lot of social, political, or cultural factors that make things like face incredibly important, something we can take into account. So, in terms of today's crisis, in terms of North Korea, I think this is very helpful because it provides a logic for what we are observing and experiencing intuitively, and that is that the prospect of a nuclear crisis with North Korea feels much more dangerous and unpredictable than other crises in our collective experience. I think that is something all sides of the debate are feeling. And that makes sense. There's high incentives for first use on both sides, and that is one of the reasons why the crisis has become, I think, so inextricably linked in broader debates about presidential authority and issues of first use, for example. I think it also explains why the efficacy of deterrence with North Korea is being so hotly debated. So let me try to break that down just a little bit. A theory. Perhaps those who say we have done deterrence before, and deterrence will work here. Deterrence is a reasonable alternative to a war. I put myself in that camp. That is definitely my view. But maybe we are not fully appreciating the volatility associated with the Firestorm model and how it predicts a higher rate of failure, even as we keenly feel the escalation risks associated with any military action against North Korea. So it's very possible that we, who believe that is the right answer, right, are not appreciating all of that uncontrollability. And that is making us be perhaps falsely confident in being able to achieve a stable deterrence posture. On the other side, perhaps those who say Kim Jong-un is undeterrable is because he's so impulsive or unpredictable, or that deterrence can't work because Kim Jong-un will be so coercive in his use of nuclear weapons that he'll simply use them as a shield for conventional aggression, which would not be, as in a deterrence relationship. So maybe that's true, but perhaps poorly described as a function of an inability to deter. Perhaps those fears are better ascribed to this lack of controllability and the risk of rapid uncontrolled escalation with the prospect of highly negative outcomes. So in other words, if you believe in that model that your chance of failure is extremely high, you may, not even consider it viable to embark on a deterrence posture that says your best possible outcome is a crisis that places you in Firestorm. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So, this made me think about my opposition in terms of the policy debate and what might be animating some of their thinking, and I think that's extremely useful. So, in other words, are advocates of preventive military action lacking appreciation of the powerful first strike incentives at play here? I think maybe they are, because they somehow maybe think we can keep this crisis from going nuclear, right? But are deterrence advocates lacking appreciation of the extreme lack of controllability, which can call into question an ability to stabilize the deterrence relationship at a reasonable level? I think this is especially true in a context like North Korea, in which there are many potential trigger points for conflict at various levels, whether it's the biting of sanctions, containment approaches, military alliances on the border, and none of those are we really going to be able to reduce? And I think that is problematic. So this takes me to the issue of you don't have a very prescriptive paper. It's pretty much descriptive of the situation, and in that sense, very useful. But not a lot of prescription in terms of where do we go from here? Do we just want to understand the box we're living in it and learn how to do it better? Or can we seek to create conditions that push this environment back along either axis? So, am I limited in that, or am I looking for ways to actually slide this to one of your other models? I think we might be able to slide it. Firestorm sounds pretty bad. So clearly we've got to recognize it and think of policy prescriptions that might work better in that space if we have to live in it. But maybe we can slide it. So I tried to think about this. Reducing incentives for first use seems to me to be less realistic, although I would love suggestions on this. But I think they're somewhat structurally baked in. And I'm not really sure how, especially in a shorter term, you can really move those. For example, reducing or changing nuclear conventional asymmetries. And many of those moves would, I think, be largely detrimental to U.S. interests. So I'm having a hard time thinking of a solution there. Improving controllability seems more promising. Can we set clearer and better communicated red lines? That sounds actionable, like something you could work on. Can we institute better forms of dialogue, improve crisis communication, establish crisis communication links? That definitely sounds like something we could work on. Could we study command and control better? I think so. Could we build better fire breaks between conventional and nuclear capabilities? Yeah, maybe, if we knew the stakes are Firestorm. So I think that really sounds worth a try. I definitely concluded that in a crisis, I'd rather be on a staircase than a firestorm. So.
Thanks, Rebecca. So maybe we can turn to Austin and then give Mark a chance to offer some responses.
Sure. So, thanks, Mark. I really enjoyed the paper. Sorry, I'm being instructed to turn my mic on.
Just push the button. No, the button on the other side.
Looks like it's on. Green? Good? Yeah, okay. So, thanks very much. So I'm a recovering academic, so I'll make a couple of academic remarks about variables. Then I'll turn to what I think Samir really wanted Rebecca and I to do, which is how might this benefit policymakers, and sort of put myself in the position of a policymaker. What questions would I need to have answered in order to make this useful in real time, in a sense? And I think there the bar is quite high, unfortunately. And then I'll talk a little bit about the DPRK scenario. So first, in terms of variables, one of the things I had a little bit of trouble with is the way you characterize first use and first use incentives, because it essentially covers everything from tactical use on your own soil, as you talked about with DPRK and Pakistan, to an attempt to completely destroy an adversary's strategic nuclear arsenal. Those things are obviously extraordinarily different, but to use them in the same variable, I think, as essentially binary variable where it covers everything, I think is quite tricky. So what is a first use? I mean, you don't talk about it, but there's the possibility of a so-called demonstration shot. Would that be a nuclear first use? And even when you're talking about limited use, I think there's variability. So you talk about the potential loss of control in the Cuban Missile Crisis from Russian nuclear torpedoes or U.S. air-to-air nuclear weapons, because we used to have those. That's not what most people think of. It is nuclear first use, but it's not the destruction of a city necessarily. In fact, the collateral damage would be functionally zero if you used it at sea. It would be meaningful, but it would be very different than even tactical use on your own soil. So I think that makes it a little tricky to sort of compare apples to apples across cases with that kind of variable. And I think there's a little bit of that in terms of some of your controllability variables, and maybe we can talk more about that if you want to. Okay, so thinking more like a policymaker, and some of this will come up again, I'm trying to imagine how policymakers would know where they were on either one of these variables in real time in a crisis. So let's talk about the first variable, incentives for first use. Well, if you look at the Cold War, there were disagreements throughout the Cold War, including in the time period you look at, about what first strike incentives were, and there was disagreement depending on where you were. You know, were you sitting in Moscow or were you sitting in Washington? So in the time period you're talking about, there was disagreement inside the highest levels of the US government about what our first strike incentives were. So the Deputy National Security Advisor in 1961, the late great Karl Kaysen, basically concluded and was quoted later as saying that, you know, could we make sure the Soviets could not launch a heavy attack on the United States? In 1961, we could do so with very high confidence, right? Very different than the way you portray the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the other hand, his boss, McGeorge Bundy, later said, well, I mean, that's great that Karl thinks that, but I didn't think that, neither did the president, right? Who knows what people thought at the time? You know, these are post facto recollections, but it is clear there was disagreement even inside the US government. Then the question is, what did Moscow think about these incentives? And there I think it looks quite different, right? The Russians put missiles in Cuba in part because they had such grave doubts about their intercontinental forces. They did not do anything to suggest they were preparing to use nuclear weapons on their side for fear of attracting the kind of US first strike you think is implausible. So they didn't change their alert levels and things like that. So I think, you know, as a policymaker in the early Cold War, it would be very difficult to sort of spell out what are our first strike incentives of the kind you're talking about. And I don't think it ends there. There's a lot of historiography that's coming out now on the late Cold War. There's a book coming out from Mark Ambinder called The Brink about the war scare of 1983. I've written some stuff on this recently. Former CIA historian Ben Fisher has written stuff on this. The short version is, even in 1983, with both sides of the Cold War having thousands of strategic nuclear warheads, the Soviets were quite afraid the US had first strike incentives. And that was partly because of our misreading of their doctrine. It was partly from things we sort of had legitimately undertaken in modernization. But the point is, we thought that the Soviets couldn't possibly believe we had first strike incentives, and yet they did. So how as a policymaker do you know where you are on this? I think the same thing is true about the characterization of doctrine. Sometimes Doctrines are clearly asymmetric, right? You talk about NATO in the Cold War, it was fairly well spelled out. We were going to use nuclear weapons first and potentially on a large scale if we had to. Other cases, I think it's a lot less clear. So many of you have probably already devoured the new nuclear posture review that came out on Friday. Its characterization of Russia's strategic nuclear doctrine is quite worrying. It suggests they have something that approaches an asymmetric doctrine for relatively early use of nuclear weapons. I happen to think, based on a variety of sources, that overstates the case significantly. But the point is, even amongst people in real time that are following this, there's a debate about what that variable is. And I think the same is true, and I'll come back to this in just a second. I think the same is probably true about the DPRK today. We don't really know. We sort of can posit, well, of course they have incentives to use nuclear weapons first, but we don't actually know. In terms of controllability, I think here you have some of the same issues, and you sort of flagged some of them. So DPRK command and control. What is DPRK command and control? We actually have very little idea, certainly at the unclassified level. I feel like Vipin Narang is sort of spiritually here since he's close to several of us, but Vipin and I have a disagreement about this based on, to Rebecca's point, what analogies we come at the problem with. Vipin looks at Pakistan and says, of course, the same incentives that Pakistan has for early nuclear use are present in North Korea, only more so they're going to look a lot like Pakistan. My view is the Russians had some of those same incentives during the Cold War, and yet they went the opposite direction. They had a very tightly controlled set of nuclear forces based on political incentives. So the reality is, in real time, we just don't know where we are. So I think this ends up, from a policymaker perspective, potentially being a very useful framework, as Rebecca said, but I'm just, I'm imagining the person that then turns to the intelligence community and says, so, which box are we in? And the IC is just going to be like, well, we have moderate confidence, we have no idea which box we're in.
Yeah.
And so I think that's true of of some of your other controllability variables like red lines, et cetera. Okay, so turning to the DPRK question, you spell out some of this, but I want to tease it out a little bit more to sort of press you on where you think we are. So what might DPRK first use look like? I think there's three possibilities, and you identify one. So one is tactical use on their own territory after coalition forces cross in. Another is use on allied territory. That could be South Korea. That could also be Japan. It could probably be others, but those are the two obvious ones. Or, at least post-development of an ICBM, or probably now, if you look at Guam or Hawaii, they could strike U.S. territory. You seem to emphasize the tactical use on their own territory, but that's only useful if there's actually ground forces on your own territory, or the DPRK's territory. It doesn't do you a lot of good if the U.S. launches the bloody nose kind of approach you allude to, right? If there's 100 cruise missiles, fire 10 at 10 targets, that's fairly limited. What's your option then? You have to go to one of these more aggressive kinds of things, and I don't know what the DPRK's incentives to do that are. I think you're right in saying if we're already at war, and you do slip a little bit in your terminology between a war will be a nuclear war, and then you talk about crisis. So, I think you're right. A war will almost certainly end up in a nuclear war, but will a crisis? I think that's a little less certain. And one of the big unknowns, and again, I'm thinking of a policymaker, planning military operations. You said any attack would likely be interpreted as an effort at comprehensive defeat. I think that's probably true, but again, if you imagine I think a very plausible hypothetical scenario, which is the moment of comedy here in the Winter Olympics ends, and there's another attempt at an ICBM test, and the U.S. launches this limited hypothetical response. I think that's unfortunately eminently plausible. What's the North Korean response? Are they going to automatically interpret that as the thin end of the regime change wedge? They might, and then I think we end up in your Firestorm box. On the other hand, maybe there are translations of Herman Khan floating around in Korean that the leader has read, and you could posit a fairly limited response from the DPRK because they have lots of limited response options. You shot 100 cruise missiles at me, fine. I'll put 101 conventional rounds into Seoul. What are you going to do now, right? So I think depending on, and this is where I think Rebecca's right to identify, particularly in these kind of regimes, the viewpoints of even a handful, maybe even one leader matters a lot. We could end up, I think, on something that looks like a very controllable staircase model, depending on the views of the leadership. So like I say, I think overall it's a well-done paper. I think the real questions lie in the details, particularly for policymakers in real time, of which box you're in. I agree with Rebecca, it's not the point of the paper, but you might be more suggestive about how to manipulate some of these variables. And I think some of them are obvious, some of them are more difficult. But some of them, basically policymakers sort of took you at your word 50 years before you wrote this paper. Both the US and the Soviets after the Cuban Missile Crisis said, well, we got to tighten up on our command and control because this could have gotten out of hand. So I think some of that's already there. You could just probably spell it out a little more. Thanks.
All right, that's fantastic. Mark, why don't you go ahead and take a few minutes just to address some of the comments, and then we'll open it up a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So I'll only be brief because I'm, interested in comments from everyone. These are terrifically helpful and thought-provoking and interesting comments. I'll just respond to sort of a few points. So on Rebecca's point that maybe those sort of advocating deterrence in relations with the North Korea are not appreciating the sort of dangers of a deterrence relationship punctuated by occasional crises of this sort, right? And I think that's true. But I think this gets to a later point you made, right? I think what deterrence advocates would want to argue, and I would count myself among them, is that we can get to a world where, or we might be able to get to a world in which US-North Korean crises might be in a different box, right? So if you could end up in a world where crises were more controllable, for example, right? Some of the things you suggested, right? More military-to-military contact with North Korea, clearer red lines, and also if North Korea had a larger, more diverse, more survivable arsenal, right? And that presumably is likely to happen over time, right? You might end up in a world in which, you're not approaching a situation where there's, nuclear parity between the US and North Korea, but a relationship that looks a little bit more like, the US-China nuclear relationship or something of that sort. Now, that's not necessarily, some of that, US policymakers may want to pursue. Some of it US policymakers certainly will not want to pursue. But I think deterrence advocates would hope that the crises that would punctuate a US-North Korea deterrent relationship might in time become less dangerous. And I think that would be what they would have to argue. And I agree also with the point that, I think at least in the short term, improving the controllability variable is easier than reducing the first use incentives on either side. Then quickly on a couple of Austin's points, I mean, I completely agree that we're bracketing a lot under this sort of incentives for first use category, and we sort of thought, at least to some degree about that and whether it's a wise thing to do. I think what we wanted to come up with was ultimately a sort of a typology that didn't have, 200 variations of nuclear crises, right? And so, I think you're right that there are you can conceive of very different types of first use, and I think we probably need to do a better job in the paper of at least being more explicit about what those different types of first use are and the way they would fit into the framework we offer. So I think I completely agree we should do a better job of that. The question of how you would know where you are in real time, I think is absolutely right. I think, and as you allude to, policymakers are trying to do this all the time, right? And so, it's not the case that, we're sort of asking policymakers to do something that they don't already sort of instinctively try to do. But But I think it's sort of an interesting question, and one that we sort of bracket in this paper, but I think might be interesting in future research, is, if you're in one particular box, but you think you're in another box, or you think you're in, or you think your opponent may think you're in some other box, or you think your opponent thinks that you think that they think that you're in some other box, right? What effects that start to have? And you very quickly end up going down a sort of rabbit hole, which is why we kind of bracket it to some degree in this paper. Nonetheless, policymakers are forced to go down that rabbit hole, and I think, in future work it would be very good for us to sort of to try to think more systematically about how that might work. On North Korea, I agree, right? You can conceive of scenarios in which North Korea might feel that it's in its interest to respond in limited ways. I guess my concern is that even if that happens, right, that the sorts of limited options we're talking about here are the kind that, in my view, are likely to lead to very quick spot, right? I mean, if large-scale shelling of Seoul is a limited response, which I think it is, right, compared to some of the other things that North Korea could potentially do, right? Is the U.S. going to view that as a okay, well, we got one hit in and they got one hit in, so okay, we'll call it a draw. I kind of find that hard to believe, and so that's, I think, that even the limited options, let alone limited nuclear options, I think it's hard for me to tell a story whereby that dynamic does not escalate pretty rapidly. I think I'll stop there. All the comments made by both Austin and Rebecca are incredibly helpful, and I have a lot of notes written down, and will help Julia and I improve the paper going forward. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, I actually want to just add one quick point in there as well, which is, as I was thinking about what Austin was saying, it seemed that a lot of the comments he's talking about with policymakers thinking about this is these are ex-ante problems, like where they locate themselves within a crisis or prior to one. But I also think the problem of coding would also be true ex post. Even though there's a little more data available, even going back to the Cold War, we can sort of have sort of insider accounts to code this. But there are two factors that I thought would be tricky to make a code. Do you code the controllability based on declaratory positions or based on inferences about capabilities or behaviors? And then the second is, would you code this based on a single country's sort of interpretation of a crisis, or might there be differing views, even ex post, by different countries as to certain risks? And the reason this is relevant here is because I think with the case of the United States and China, we talk a lot about nuclear risks in South Asia, but we come at it from very different positions and interpret them differently. So even our assessment of risks in Kargil or in crises in 2001, 2002 are quite different in terms of how much we believe declaratory doctrine or private assurances and how we interpret behaviors and what they mean. So it is a problem that I think that would be true even for academics after the fact, or for practitioners trying to infer lessons from these crises. All right. I'll leave it at that, and then we'll maybe just open up some questions. So if you get called upon, please wait for the microphone, introduce yourself, and then phrase your question in the form of a question so we can actually have a response. And feel free to pose questions to anyone on the panel, and I think we'll just give the opportunity for the panel to speak. So we'll start with this gentleman right here.
Thank you. This is Ahmed Khan from Atlantic Council. In your findings about Kargil crisis, I think there's a need to revisit some of your finding about Pakistan command and control structure. You said that Pakistan has unreliable command and control structure at that time, but I think Pakistan showed a lot of restraint at that time, and you have to substantiate Pakistan's motivation of restricting or spiraling down the spiraling effect of the crisis to some kind of escalation. And today, Pakistan has state-of-the-art command and control structure, and it's keep on improving. So, but the question is here that what is the evidence that Pakistan have and Pakistan still have an unreliable command and control structure.
Okay, and maybe we can also just back into the just generally, how do you assess reliability of command and control more broadly?
Yeah, so in terms of, I agree actually that Pakistan showed restraint in some sense in the Kargil War, right? And I mentioned there were a lot of things that Pakistan did during the crises that were a way for it to signal the limited nature of its goals. Although the goals were clearly revisionist, right? They were also limited in important ways. My concern with Pakistan's command and control is less in terms of the reliability of it, and more that Pakistan's nuclear posture, by aiming to threaten the first use of nuclear weapons in a crisis, right, as a part of the effort to make that credible, right? I think there's a lot of writing and a lot of evidence to suggest that one of the things they do is to make their missiles highly mobile, right? It's to give battlefield commanders the authorization to use under certain circumstances, and that leads to concerns about controllability, independent of their effects on the incentives for first use, right? So that's where I would come down on the Pakistani case.
Anyone else have some thoughts on that? All right. Any other questions, sir?
Hi, Andy Cook. I'm very interested in your red lines, Mark, because obviously there's been a number of those drawn recently, and are they therefore not a bit of a red herring? Taking on what Rebecca said, of course, a lot driven by policymakers who draw those red lines and the personalities behind that, but also, of course, underpinned by, I think something really where Austin's coming from is, even though there's red line drawn, is the doctrine paper anything intent there to enforce?
Yeah, so I think this is actually a really important distinction, right? You may have, you would want, and I should have probably said this in the talk, right? It's not only that you want your red lines to be kind of clear and mutually understood, right? You also want them to be understood as credible, right? And so one of the the criticisms of the non-proliferation, the nuclear posture review, right, is that this threat to potentially have a nuclear response to to strategic non-nuclear attacks, right? Well, that's a clear red line in some sense, but arguably it's not credible that the United States would actually escalate to nuclear use over an attack of that sort, right? So you might end up with a red line that is clear but not credible, and that I think would contribute to non-controllability in the same way as an unclear red line would do.
Sir. Yep.
Sorry. It's a follow-on from the last question.
Could you just tell us your affiliation as well?
Very Taylor, from International Council for Life Sciences. It's a follow-on from the last question on red lines. And it's how uncertainty, deliberately pursued as a policy, plays into the model that you've described to us. It seems to me, looking at the different scenarios you painted against to justify the model, that uncertainty is hugely important for the party that's at a disadvantage, particularly conventionally, but also from a nuclear point of view. So I'd like to draw all the speakers out on this, the value of uncertainty. And it seems to me that putting a red line down is not helpful. I think you need to draw away from the US use of the red line, which I think is rather different from the circumstances, for example, the Pakistan situation or the DPRK perspective. So I'd like to draw you out just a little bit more on that. And there really needs to be a study of this uncertainty part. Thank you.
Great. Can we start with you, but everyone can take a crack at this?
Yeah. So again, I think this is a really important point, right? And I mentioned in my comments back to Rebecca, right? This idea that we may be able to, it might be desirable for the U.S. and North Korea to move in a direction where their where their red lines are sort of better understood, are more clear, right? But as you sort of allude to, right, it's not in North Korea's interest to clarify their red lines. They want, for the weaker power, right, there are strong incentives for them to want to make the United States afraid that nuclear use may happen, right, as soon as they do certain things, right? And so there may be very strong strategic incentives for ambiguous red lines, even if that comes at the cost of some degree of controllability. And I think it does come at the cost of some degree of controllability, right? So, and that's true of a lot of these things that contribute to controllability, right? It's not an... Right, a lot of these things, right, aren't solved in certain crises because it's not in states' interests to solve them, right? The reason that Pakistan, for example, might want to pre-delegate authority to use nuclear weapons under certain circumstances to battlefield commanders, right? That does reduce controllability, but that's a feature, not a bug, right? That's why they want to do it, right? It's to make the first use of nuclear weapons more credible. So. I think there are often incentives for weaker states to have at least somewhat ambiguous red lines to make the more powerful state think twice about potential military actions that they might undertake. So yeah, I agree.
Actually, I'm finding as I listen to this, we may need to unpack uncertainty and make sure uncertainty is what I think of as uncertainty as opposed to ambiguity. So let me just pull that thread a little bit. Ambiguity, to me, is the benefit to a policymaker of not having to be absolutely clear. It's the trade-off with a clear red line, right? We choose to have some ambiguity when we want to have flexibility in our options. So, and that's, in the most recent NPR, right, there was a very clear description that said, we think we need actually a little more ambiguity in terms of U.S. responses to different types of strategic attack. You can agree or disagree with that, but that's the choice, right? We're going to be a little less clear and a little more ambiguous to send a message that we might react in a different way. Uncertainty, at least in my mind, is what characterizes the environment in crisis, which is really different. Uncertainty is the space that policymaker is living in. And I think that goes back a little bit to this discussion about, which box am I in? And, when I task the IC to tell me which box I'm in, they're going to come back and say medium confidence, I don't know. That's because that will never happen, right? Each new crisis will be its own idiosyncratic thing. And each step on either side of a decision will be uncertainty. Will this have the reaction I'm betting is the more likely predictable reaction, or will it not? The fundamental thing being, I don't know. And so you have to keep walking through the crisis, never knowing what's going to happen. And I think academically, we often forget that because we're looking at a case study where we know how the story ends. But when you're living it, you don't know how the story is going to end, and that feels very different. So I think that's important. So when you go to in a crisis, I actually don't think it's important to know which box you're in. What I think is important is to know what are the checking questions that you need to ask yourself to make sure a wrong assumption is not guiding your thinking to a place that is unhelpful. So, are you sure that X? Have you checked on Y? Have you looked into, and that's where if I was being prescriptive with your paper, checking questions would help you kind of go, I've got a hidden bias here that maybe isn't helpful. That's where I would go with that. And it wouldn't solve the uncertainty problem in crisis, but it might help your boundaries a little bit.
So I'll just say a couple of words. I think Rebecca's right to separate ambiguity from uncertainty, though they're obviously related.
Yep.
And so ambiguity can be helpful and harmful. It's probably the most double-edged of policy swords, right? So on the one hand, a certain degree of ambiguity, as Rebecca said, gives you flexibility as a policymaker in when and how you'll respond. And policymakers love nothing more than flexibility in when and how to respond. The problem is your signaling is not very clear to the individual or actor you're trying to deter. So they may stumble across a red line or an important interest or however you want to characterize it in a way that maybe even you yourself did not understand beforehand. And I think the first Gulf War is a bit of an example of this, where the U.S. was ambiguous about how it felt about Kuwait and only kind of figured out that we really cared after the invasion. On the other hand, drawing bright lines reduces that space, and sometimes you figure out the same thing later. And I think this is more the Korean War story, where we were actually fairly unambiguous about where our defense perimeter was until we figured out, well, maybe it should be a little bigger than we initially thought. So the advantage of that clarity is the actor you're trying to deter knows, at least with some degree of confidence, therefore less uncertainty about where you might take action. But there's always this question about, and it's a version of the stability-instability paradox, if they know your threshold is very clearly defined as here, do they not just do everything up to that, right? This idea of so-called salami slicing. So I think it works both ways. In terms of uncertainty itself, I think it's generally pretty useful for deterrence. And here I'm thinking about uncertainty in terms of what happens when military actions are undertaken. I mentioned the differing perceptions in the late Cold War, where the United States thought it had no meaningful first strike advantage, and the Soviets actually thought it had quite a meaningful first strike advantage. That was probably on net good for deterrence, as long as you could avoid the kind of crises Marx talks about, right? So the idea was you want sort of enough uncertainty about military outcomes that nobody even wants to walk up to the brink of crisis. And that's kind of the best I think you can hope for in terms of uncertainty on these things.
Okay, well, we've got quite a few now, so let me start back there and we'll move our way over.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti, and I had a question. I go back to this theme of the individual's role in the planning and analysis of this, and it seems to me there's a vast difference in terms of the threat, the perceived threat for individuals in different circumstances. In the first Gulf War, the threat that Saddam Hussein faced was the loss of Kuwait. Okay, I could live with that. In the second Gulf War, the threat that Saddam Hussein faced was unconditional surrender with virtual certainty of painful death on your part, as well as the part of everybody in your family. If Saddam Hussein did have nuclear weapons, it's not likely he would use them in the first Gulf War, because the adversary's goal was limited. But when you have the goal of unconditional surrender with the likelihood of painful death and painful death for everyone in your family, as is likely the case in DPRK today, then there is no difference between ending the world and ending my life and the life of the people in my country. So it becomes very personal to the perception, but it also turns on the framework of the adversary. If it's unconditional surrender, why not?
Okay, so
comments on that.
That's very helpful. So I think that that kind of backs into a conversation we were having earlier, Mark, about the stakes. So the paper seems to sort of be at least agnostic about the stakes, at least in the current model. So how does that factor in?
Yeah, so exactly, right. So the paper and the way I presented it here, right, the stakes involved in a crisis are not at least explicitly one of the things we think about. That being said, I think they do come in an important way, which is to say that if you think that these crises, right, these different types of crises have different levels of danger attached to them, then presumably statesmen, people involved in these kind of crises should be prepared to go into these crises to a different level based on the stakes, right? So in my view, if you're in a situation where any crisis would be a firestorm crisis, you should only be prepared to go into that kind of crisis if the stakes are really high, right? Whereas if you're in one of the other crises where the risk of nuclear use is fairly low, right, you may be more prepared to go into a crisis of that sort, even on an issue that's of relatively limited stakes, because you know the risks are somewhat less, right? So I think that's the way in which the stakes kind of end up playing into the argument here.
Rebecca.
I'll just say a quick word on stakes. I think you're right, but back to this idea of uncertainty, it's not always clear sort of in the moment what the limitations are. So it was a deliberate decision by the United States to signal very, very limited war aims in the first Gulf War, partly for the reason you thought, but the United States also was much more successful in its conventional operations than we anticipated. Many of you will remember anticipating thousands of deaths, and in fact, in 100 hours, we had basically destroyed the Iraqi army. If you're Saddam, and we had, of course, struck lots of regime targets, et cetera, if you're Saddam, and you're on day 2 of that 4-day war, you might suddenly think, well, wait a minute, is the U.S. actually going to stop? So I think it can be hard to tell in sort of real time exactly what aims are, even if people sort of declare them, because they can obviously change. It turns out that the opposite is actually the case. For various reasons, Saddam actually got more dismissive of U.S. resolve as time went on. So even in 2003, he thought, yeah, okay, they might take Kurdistan, which is already gone, and they might take southern Iraq, but they're not coming to Baghdad. He didn't start to believe that until we were on the way to Baghdad. So it's weird how people sort of, gets into this idea about what people believe sort of shaping these things.
Okay, so we had a couple more, and why don't we bundle them together, and then we'll get some final concluding remarks. So, Deborah.
Thank you. I'm Deborah Decker with the Stimson Center. One comment and then a question. I was in the State Department in the 70s when we were working on SALT talks, and Robert Jervis and his work on signals and indices was really important. And back then it was, of course, classified of the national technical means that we had, but that was part of the indices. And I think it would be useful to maybe look at that a little bit more closely, which gets us to the question of, clarity about our aims and what do we want and how do we signal that and what are our indices. So I'd like you all to take on the role of the prescriptive role that you were mentioning, Rebecca, and say, okay, now what? I mean, if you're the United States, what should be your aims, and what's the end game here? Originally, the discussion of regime change, of course, getting back to the stakes question, was very high. What could we want, what should we want, and how do we get there?
Okay, so we'll take one more, and then we'll bundle them all together. Yeah.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Larkin. I focus on Asia issues for the Forum on International Affairs. And I guess this question could be handled either academically or from the policy-making side. How would the research was presented today take into account the perceptions of the antagonists in a nuclear crisis? How would it take into account the perceptions of their allies or partners? In the case of U.S. North Korea, we have the United States, you have South Korea as a U.S. ally, and then I don't know if ally is a good word for China vis-a-vis North Korea, but how do they constrain or accelerate whether or not nuclear weapons are used? And I guess this could also qualify in an India-Pakistan crisis situation as well for other allies and partners involved there too. Thank you.
Okay, great. So a couple questions on prescriptions and then impact on, or how does the allies and partners variable affect the model? Do you want to start, Mark, or do you want to?
Sure. So I'll take a crack at this question. I mean, I think the degree to which these crises are, dangerous and to different degrees, and the extent to which the dangers in these types of crises are different, right? The risks of uncontrolled escalation versus deliberate escalation affects the interests of allies, right? So, it's not surprising to me that, right, the South Koreans seem to be pretty terrified, right, about a potential crisis on the Korean Peninsula, right? Because I think they understand that it would be very hard to keep such a crisis limited. It would be very hard to prevent retaliation, and therefore they are prepared to do more to stop the United States from going into a crisis of that sort, right? So I think the dynamics you anticipate in a potential crisis should affect the extent to which allies or adversaries are prepared to do things to either prevent crises from happening or to encourage them under potentially under other circumstances. Right, in terms of what we should sort of do now, I mean, in my view, the best path forward in U.S.-North Korean relations would be to essentially take regime change off the table. I mean, I think, and to pursue the kind of building of communication avenues and crisis management strategies that would acknowledge that, there is nothing really on the Korean Peninsula that is sufficiently vital to U.S. national interest to risk military, to risk the kind of crisis that I think would happen if the U.S. went to war on the Korean Peninsula, and therefore, right, hopefully move the relationship towards a more stable deterrent relationship, understanding the risks that such a relationship holds. I think that the risks of the alternative are sufficiently grave and worrying that gamble is worth taking.
I would give just a couple of thoughts. First, on the issue of allies, I think it is a very interesting and important point to raise. I think the way I would put it into the discussion of the models is, I think the model is built, because it can only be so complicated, right, is built on the notion that the actors involved own their own decision space. Mm-hmm. So the reality about having allies is you actually don't own all the decision space, which means you don't own the latitude to behave in what is supposed to be your predictable way, if that makes sense. So that's really important for everyone. We might say the logical, I'm going to be crystal clear about my red line and I'm going to communicate this, but if South Korea says no, right, we don't own all the space. And we don't own all the space in crisis, especially when things are that close together, because we're dependent upon how other actors act to either enable what we need to do or constrain what we want to do. And so that's a very important dynamic that'll be challenging to incorporate into a model. On this issue of what to do, it's very, to state the painfully obvious, it's very hard. It's very hard in a particular way, though. We can't simply take, quote, we can take regime change off, so we can say we do not have an explicit goal of regime change. We can try to communicate that. But what I don't think is realistic from a U.S. policy perspective is I'm going to accept you as an equal, is I'm going to let you build up your nuclear and conventional capabilities so we have less asymmetry so we feel more stable, right? Like that's almost silly, right? We are not going to evolve to a deterrence posture that does not include a highly constraining containment posture. And that containment, and this is, I think, the safer version, right? This is better, in my opinion, than a strike, but it is still very dangerous. And that's because every action we take to contain these other aspects of North Korean behavior will be perceived through an adversarial lens. And any one of them could be seen as the provocation that encourages them to respond. Yeah. We are not going to be able, I think, to take all that off the table. And that is what's required if you really want to move the model, right? Yeah. So I don't think that that's going to happen. But what we have to do is at least maybe take the very top bit of that off. So at least the escalation path is a little shorter, you have a little more room, but you're not going to get all the way down to something stable.
So I'll take a little bit different tack than Rebecca. So, Mark talked a lot about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but of course the other big crises of that era were over Berlin. And we sort of forget those, but they were pretty dangerous as well. But we don't have very many of those after the Cuban Missile Crisis, either Berlin or Cuba, obviously. And I think the main reason is both sides realized that they needed to have, even if it was an annoying status quo that they agreed to, there was a status quo about Berlin and about Cuba that could be agreed to. So this is related to taking regime change off the table, but it's a little more than that, right? So the deal with Berlin was Berlin stays divided, Germany stays divided, Germany gets to rearm conventionally, but Germany doesn't get to rearm in a nuclear way. Everybody was kind of annoyed by that, but they could live with it. We eventually, confirmed that a decade later by treaty. No more Berlin crises. So that was a big part of it. The other part was an agreement over Cuba. Cuba, the United States pledged tacitly, but in a meaningful way, to not knock off the Castro regime, and in exchange, the Soviets said they would not put nuclear weapons there, and we had a little kerfuffle that you probably remember in Cienfuegos, but that was a kerfuffle. It was not actually a real crisis. So I think if you want to get away from the risk of these escalatory crises, potentially escalatory crises, we have to have some kind of status quo that both sides can sign up for. Because it's easy to forget, we're on year, 60-something of an armistice? Can you imagine the Cold War if there had never been a resolution of the Berlin crisis, right? I mean, in a way, it's almost thank God for the Berlin Wall, because it kept us from having a war. We lack that on the Korean Peninsula. And so I think absent that kind of, maybe mutually annoying status quo that's agreed to, it's going to be hard. But it gets to the Allied point, right? You have to sell whatever that status quo is to the South Koreans. It's not just a bilateral U.S.-North Korea treaty. And so to Rebecca's point, I think that greatly complicates things. I think in terms of controllability, Mark could probably adapt the model that's where allies enter in, is they affect controllability, right? So if your ally does something stupid and pulls you into a crisis, that's limiting your controllability. On the other hand, you could imagine allied postures that increase controllability by constraining decision space.
Well, great. Well, I think at least I know I've learned a lot about nuclear crises in this discussion. I appreciate Mark and his co-author Julia for the presentation and the arguments, and to Rebecca and Austin for some really incisive comments. And thanks for all of you for joining us today, and for those of you online. We'll be doing another one of these next week, actually. Not on nuclear crisis. We're going to go down the escalation ladder to secessionism and civil conflict with a new book by Essen Butt, who's a non-resident fellow here with the Stimson Center. So hopefully we'll see some of you back next week. But thanks again.